good afternoon, and good evening for people who are joining us from different parts of the world. Thank you all for joining us today, and apologies that it had to be rescheduled for the last time. So this is a really exciting webinar. I'm really excited for this because this would be like first activity after the official launch of our local focus area group on urban resilience. So as a co-chair, I'm thrilled of urban resilience. I'm thrilled to welcome you all for the first activity, which focuses on critical importance of urban resilience. So our local focus area is developed to address the growing challenges that urban communities face in the adapting to climate impacts and enhancing their resilience. We recognize the essential role of remote sensing in monitoring, analyzing, and responding to these challenges, especially in developing equitable solutions that addresses disparity between developed and developing worlds. Through this initiative, we aim to promote dialogue, research, and innovative approaches to urban resilience with a specific focus on bridging the equity gap in areas like urban heat, flooding, and infrastructure adaptation. So to start with this journey on the webinar on urban greening for thermal equity, urban greening is not only a vital strategy for enhancing urban resilience, but also a powerful tool for achieving thermal equity in our cities. The impacts of heat stress are not distributed equally, and this session will shed a light on how urban greening can be leveraged to mitigate these inequities. We are incredibly fortunate to have Professor Jason Byrne as our speaker. Jason is a professor of human geography and planning at the University of Tasmania and a globally recognized expert in the urban green space, climate change adaptation, and environmental inequity, with a strong focus on urban heat resilience. He has over 150 scholarly publications and a named researcher with more than $20 million grant in funding. So Jason's contribution to the field have had an impactful reach, and he also serves as an associate editor for landscape and urban planning. So over to you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Pooja. Wow, what a wonderful introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who's joining us from around the world today. I'm delighted to be able to share the seminar with you. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that I am talking with you from Launceston, Tasmania, where the University of Tasmania is based. We are on stolen land. This land belongs to the Mawinina people, who unfortunately are no longer with us. Aboriginal people in Tasmania have cared for this country for tens of thousands of years and have suffered the impacts of colonisation and genocide. I want to acknowledge the importance of Aboriginal science and the caring that Aboriginal people have done in the past and still continue to do for lands right around Australia, but also here, especially in Tasmania. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and stand for a future that acknowledges Indigenous cultures and justice. Many of you will be familiar with these sorts of images, which have made headlines around the world over the past few years. The years 2022 and 2023 were among the hottest on record, and in particular were characterised by heat waves across the Northern Hemisphere. Many of these extreme heat events occurred in places that have not seen these sorts of temperatures before, such as on the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Canada, which experienced temperatures of 40 degrees or higher. Recent research that's been published in leading journals around the world has shown that these heat waves collectively caused in the order of 70,000 excess deaths. Heat waves in Australia are termed the silent killer. They're emerging as a global threat, as I've just discussed, but heat waves in Australia kill more people than all other natural hazards. In fact, they kill more people than all other natural hazards combined. People who are most at risk of disease and death from heat waves include older people who are 65 years of age and older, young children, people who have medical conditions, outdoor workers, and people on lower incomes. Tasmania, where I'm from, as you can see from this image, is not immune to heat waves and indeed does suffer from severe and extreme heat waves. Climate change and heat wave impacts are occurring against a backdrop of rapid urbanisation. Most of the world's population now live in cities, about 55%. By the middle of this century, that'll be closer to 2/3, and by the end of this century, closer to 3/4 of the world's population living in cities. In cities, we see heat impacts magnified and pronounced due to the surface materials that we have in cities, which absorb, trap, and radiate heat. Hard surfaces in cities can comprise up to 2/3 of the urban land area, and green spaces in cities may fall as low as 16% of the city on average, or even lower. And there's some important statistics to bear in mind here as I work through the seminar today. Research in the United Kingdom has shown that mortality increases up to 3% with every 1 degree Celsius rise in temperatures above 20 degrees Celsius. We also see that for each 1 degree rise in temperature, there's an associated demand increase in electricity by 2 to 4%. And in Tasmania, where recent research has found that even low intensity heat waves, so this is heat waves in the high 20s, are associated with a 9% increase in deaths. There's a real challenge facing us, a challenge for how we adapt our cities that were built for cooler climates to cope with the climates that are coming in the decades ahead. Importantly, in Australia, rapid urbanisation has created a lot of demand for new housing, and planning policies that are designed to accommodate increased population growth typically do so by increasing densities in our cities. And I'll come back to this point later in the seminar. One of the important issues that I want to explore today is known as the surface urban heat island effect. Cities are substantially warmer than the surrounding countryside. This difference in temperature between the urban core and the periphery is as high as 15 degrees in some cities, especially those in warmer climates. We also know that green spaces and trees, like street trees, can reduce temperatures. Neighbourhood parks can decrease temperatures by up to 7 degrees Celsius. Street trees can decrease temperatures by 8 degrees Celsius or more, and this extends up to half a kilometre, depending on the distance from the green space. Over roads, trees can decrease temperatures by up to 20 degrees Celsius. So urban green infrastructure, street trees and parks, can make a big difference in cooling cities. However, this green space is not equitably distributed in built environments. Most of the urban tree canopy cover in Australia's cities is located on private property. We'll come back to this point later in the seminar. Tasmania, as I mentioned before, is not immune to climate change. While temperatures have risen at a fairly low rate compared to the global background, these temperature increases are escalating. Compared to the rest of Australia, Tasmania will see less pronounced increases in temperature, but these temperature increases will still be quite dramatic. Under a high emission scenario, this is expected to be up to 3.3 degrees Celsius higher by the end of the century. We've had the government in Tasmania do a range of work examining the impacts of climate change in the state. And the ones I want to focus on are the fact that the state is expected to become hotter and drier with more heat waves in the future. When we look at Launceston, our case study city, and I'll introduce Launceston in more detail shortly, but this is compared against the 4 cities in Tasmania. In Launceston, our future climate will be more like Wagga Wagga in outback New South Wales, where it's substantially hotter and substantially drier than what Launceston experiences today. Here's what I want to zero in on today in terms of the key focus. Heat does not impact all people equally, as Pooja acknowledged in her introduction. The people who are most affected by heat include Aboriginal people, younger children, older people, people who are homeless, immigrants and refugees who do not necessarily have access to information about how to shelter in the time of a heat wave, people with a disability, and people with insecure housing tenure, among many others. We call this disproportionate impact of heat on communities who are experiencing marginality and disadvantage, we call that thermal inequity. The Sustainable Development Goals that you'll be familiar with can be directly relevant for heatwave action. The most relevant of these is taking action for sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11. But there's a range of other goals that are involved as well, as you can see on this slide, including reduced inequalities, life on land, and climate action. There's two domains for responding to heat waves in spatial planning. So my background is as a town planner, environmental planner, urban planner. And these two strategies are mitigation and adaptation. While I've shown a range of different measures on this slide, from a mitigation perspective, green space can act as a carbon sink, and so can forest protection. From an adaptation perspective, green space can cool cities, as we've just discussed, improve people's well-being and protect biodiversity. So that's an adaptation response. Let's take a moment just to look at some of the various benefits of urban greening, and we can consider those in a bit more detail. From an environmental perspective, urban greening can help us regulate urban temperatures, cooling those ambient temperatures, as I've just explained. But there's a whole host of other environmental benefits associated with trees and green spaces. And these include lowering wind speeds, enhancing or augmenting habitats, and reducing runoff from stormwater. There's also a range of social benefits from urban greening, and these include reducing morbidity and mortality, relieving stress, and encouraging higher levels of social interaction. And there's a host of economic benefits from urban greening. I've already mentioned reducing stormwater and associated stormwater management costs. There's also benefits around decreasing healthcare expenses and increasing property values. But this property value question can also be a problem of trees, because if we increase property values in the city through urban greening, it can displace those very populations who experience marginality and disadvantage as they're forced out of houses due to rising rents or due to increases in land tax associated with rising property values. So it can be a double-edged sword. There's a range of other environmental costs associated with trees, and these include human-wildlife conflict, animal attack in the city, for example, reduced wind speed, and lowering groundwater. There's other social costs associated with urban greening, which include, if you plant the wrong trees, it can lead to volatile organic compounds in the built environment. And finally, there are some economic costs associated with urban greening. As I mentioned, gentrification, but also if you plant the wrong tree in the wrong place, it can lead to increased heating costs, damage to infrastructure, as I've shown in the image here on the slide, and increases in insurance costs if, for example, housing is damaged by trees that are downed during a storm event. So the key message here is that implementation matters. What we're looking for is the right tree in the right place at the right time. So location is vitally important. So too is planting the right tree to ensure that there's a broad canopy rather than conical trees. If trees are planted too densely, it can lead to perverse outcomes such as increased temperatures at night in built environments, which is when we want to be reducing temperatures. That's where we often land up with increases in morbidity and mortality is during the nighttime when people's bodies can't cool down. We also want to make sure that we take into account people's preferences and their attitudes and their values. There's no point planting a whole bunch of trees in a built environment if people hate those trees, because the trees will then be vandalized or they won't survive into maturity. And then finally, we want to make sure that local governments and state governments have the resources to support parks, urban greening and tree planting in cities. Because if we undertake greening at a scale that is not sustainable economically from the institution's perspective, this too can land up with perverse consequences. So here's our case study city. I want to focus on Launceston in Tasmania, as I mentioned earlier. This image of Launceston shows us that it is a very historic city in Tasmania. It has a long tradition going back as Tasmania's second largest city. It's located in northern Tasmania, as I'll show you in a moment, and has very beautiful architecture, as you can see in this image. Launceston is located in the north of Tasmania. It's a small city of about 71,000 people. The main risk that people are most familiar with in Launceston from an environmental hazard perspective is flooding. And as you can see on this photograph, there are large levees that run alongside the river to try and reduce that flood risk. Many people in Launceston are not aware that the city faces a fourfold increase in heat waves by the middle of this century. Part of the heat risk in Launceston is due to the characteristics of the built environment. We can see from these photographs that represent a cross-section of Launceston's architecture that the combination of dark-coloured roofs, of density, of low levels of tree planting, and of high car dependence, so lots of on-street parking and wide roads, means that the city is particularly vulnerable to increases in urban temperature. The urban densification that I mentioned at the beginning of the seminar to accommodate increases in population means that we're seeing this sort of development in Launceston in Tasmania and elsewhere in other cities in Tasmania. As you can see from the image on the bottom left, large areas of green space are being developed into, by Australian standards, what we would consider to be medium density housing. So this is still single story, but as you can see in the top left image here, there is a lot of concrete, dark roofs, and very little in the way of vegetation being provided in these new housing estates. The image on the lower right-hand corner is of social housing in Hobart, which does have a bit more green space around it, but overall you can see a pattern of the loss of green space to accommodate increases in population. The work that I'm going to tell you about now has been done in response to the City of Launceston's work to develop an urban greening strategy for the city. We employed a range of indicators to assess vulnerability to heat, and these indicators are both physical and social. The indicators derive from the work of Susan Cutter and her seminal work on people's vulnerability to natural hazards and on environmental inequalities. So from a physical point of view, we can see that increases in density, the characteristics of landform, such as an aspect that faces the sun in summer and winter, vegetation cover, the design of buildings, the infrastructure of the city, and the availability of public transport all affect people's vulnerability to heat. From a social perspective, being a non-English speaker and therefore not having access to information about heat waves and heat vulnerability, not having secure tenure, meaning you cannot modify the place that you're renting, being a person of colour, or living away from public transport, having a disability, being a female head of household, not having a stable income, or being a seasonal worker or service sector employee can make you at heightened risk of heat impacts in the city. We used a combination of methods in our work for the City of Launceston's urban greening strategy, and I'll just spend a little bit of time working on breaking those down now and explaining the different methods that we used. First, we used remote sensing. So we took satellite imagery at 50 centimetre resolution, and working with our industry partner GeoNeon, we employed convolutional neural network analysis to map the tree canopy across the city of Launceston. We were also able to map buildings and roads as part of this work. By training the algorithm to discern trees, we reached a 95% level of accuracy in this work, so we're very confident on the results. This enabled us to map the tree canopy cover across the city. We also used optical imagery from Landsat to map land surface temperatures across Launceston, as has been done for many cities around the world. One of the problems with this, though, is that Landsat is only above Launceston at 11 a.m. in the morning, which means we don't see the full effect of summertime heating on the city, which usually occurs much later in the day, around 3 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Nonetheless, if we look at across a season or across a year of data of different seasons, we can see variations in temperature above and below the mean, which is what we've used here to identify land that seems to be at heightened risk of heat through land surface temperature, increased land surface temperature. Next, we undertook a vulnerability assessment using the Australian Bureau of Statistics census. We took a particular index called the Index of Relative Advantage and Disadvantage, which is a key component of that census. This index combines some of the previously mentioned indicators of vulnerability, for example, single head of household, being dependent upon private automobile, being a renter, having a low income. These various indicators are merged to give us a comparative level of advantage or disadvantage on a scale of 1:10, and I'll show you this work shortly. We also undertook workshops with stakeholders, key stakeholders, to try and understand their awareness of climate change impacts, their preferences for different kinds of greening, their concerns about climate change. Combining these various methods, we then held workshops with policymakers to help them understand what the threat and the risk was from heat, and to come up with potential strategies to mitigate that heat. And ultimately, this was adopted in the City of Launceston's urban greening strategy. So this is what that work looks like. We can see here that overall, the City of Launceston has just shy of 20% tree canopy cover. But that tree cover is not uniformly distributed across the city. The environmental justice literature tells us that people who are wealthier can afford to live in neighbourhoods with higher levels of tree canopy cover. People who are less wealthy are often relegated to those parts of the city that have lower levels of tree canopy cover. And this wealth effect is also visible in Launceston, as I shall now unpack. We found that tree canopy is indeed unevenly distributed across the built environment of Launceston. In the northern suburbs of the city that are characterised by higher levels of socioeconomic disadvantage, we find much lower levels of tree canopy cover. So let's take an example here. If we look at Invermay, the tree canopy cover is as low as 7%. This is in contrast to Prospect, one of the wealthier parts of Launceston, where tree canopy cover is around 44% of the suburb. What sets this apart from other work that's been done in Australia is this is the first time that tree canopy mapping has been done for a regional city in Australia. And if we compare this result with work that's been done in Melbourne, for example, on the mainland, we can see that the wealthiest parts of Launceston have a tree canopy cover commensurate with the wealthiest parts of Melbourne, in fact, exceeding some of those wealthy parts of Melbourne. However, the less wealthy neighbourhoods in Launceston, those with the lowest levels of tree canopy cover, are much lower than other parts of Launceston. Sorry, other parts of Melbourne. So let's look at the socioeconomic analysis now. We can see here on the left-hand side, this index of relative socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage, ranging on those deciles from 0 through to 10, with 10 being comparatively very advantaged and 1 being very disadvantaged, and 0 meaning we have no data available. Here you can see that pattern very strongly expressed, with the areas experiencing high levels of socioeconomic disadvantage being the northern parts of the city of Launceston, and those areas with comparatively much better socioeconomic advantage are located in the southern parts of the city. Similarly, if we look at the left-hand image here, we can see that there is a pronounced difference in temperature, land surface temperature across the city. It's very evident here, the river valley around which the city is built. You can see it snaking its way through the image in the very cool blue colour. So too, we can see the centre of the city characterised by much higher temperatures, comparatively speaking, and those northern suburbs comparatively much hotter than other parts of the city. Now, if we combine this analysis, if we combine the socioeconomic analysis with the land surface temperature analysis and the vegetation mapping for the city, it's possible to come up with a composite index where we can identify the city's comparative vulnerability to heat from very low vulnerability in those deep purple colours, all the way through to high to very high vulnerability in those orange and yellow colours. And that's the image we see in the middle of the slide here, the composite image. We've done this work for Launceston, obviously, but we've also replicated this work for the city of Hobart. As both these images show, there are parts of the 2 largest cities in Tasmania that are characterised by comparative wealth and low levels of vulnerability to heat, and also comparative disadvantage and comparatively high vulnerability to heat. One of the things that we have observed is that life expectancy correlates with tree canopy cover. So if we look at Hobart, for example, the life expectancy in the wealthiest and leafiest suburbs of the city is around 87 years of age. That's median life expectancy. This is analogous to the life expectancy that we would find in the wealthiest parts of the world, such as Hong Kong or Monaco. In contrast, the life expectancy in the northern suburbs of Hobart, around Bridgewater and Brighton, falls as low as 67 years of age. That's a 20-year difference. And that's comparable with places like Bangladesh. So we see this polarized inequity, and that's expressed spatially across both of Tasmania's largest cities. Now we can take this work and we can look at how it might impact schools, which we've done for Launceston. We've mapped the location of the different schools across the city, and we've looked at tree canopy cover for those schools, and we see similar patterns to what we've observed for the index of relative advantage and disadvantage. in those same northern suburbs of Launceston, where tree canopy is low, not surprisingly, the schools in those locations also have comparatively much lower tree canopy cover. The inverse is true with the wealthier suburbs, at schools located in those suburbs having comparatively high levels of tree canopy cover. Now, you might remember at the beginning of the seminar, I mentioned access to public transportation is important from the perspective of vulnerability to heat. The reason for this is that you need to be able to escape where you live in those extreme levels of heat. In Australia, we define a heat wave as 3 or more days where temperatures are significantly hotter than the prevailing average temperature for that time of the year. This means that heat waves can occur year round in winter and in summer, but they're most pronounced in summer. That's where we feel the effects. So you can imagine children coming back from their summer holidays, going to school with low levels of tree canopy cover, will be at heightened risk of health impacts from those extreme heat events. But we also know from the international literature that this can be related to behavioural difficulties in schools when it's hotter and difficulties in learning. What this means ultimately is that you land up with disadvantage resonating or echoing across generations. And we see the same thing here with bus stops, with public transport, as I mentioned just a second ago. If you can't leave the area where you live to move to somewhere that's cooler to escape those effects of heat, if you have no private vehicle or only one private vehicle per family, you might find that you are confined to a neighbourhood where it's hotter, where your house is hotter, and you're unable to leave for somewhere else where it's comparatively cooler. So we looked at access to bus stops with good tree canopy cover, and we find the same socio-spatial inequalities manifested across the city. The one difference being in the urban core where there's no tree canopy cover of bus stops. And as you'll see from some of the images that I will show you, this is because there's parts of Launceston with very little tree cover in the urban core. But again, we see that same pattern occurring across the northern suburbs with parts of the city that have very little tree canopy cover, also having bus stops with little to no tree canopy cover. And in summer, this can mean that you are stuck waiting for a bus in extreme heat, which will have real impacts on your health and well-being. Right, let's just shift gears a little bit and look at the results of the workshops. We took this information that I've just talked about with you to community workshops to get people's responses to the problem, the patterns of inequality that I've just identified, and also to ask for potential solutions. So the workshop format was around 90 minutes long, and it was recorded on digital recorders. We ran it like a focus group with small numbers of people, quite an intimate conversation of up to 15 people talking about a series of questions that I'll show you in a minute. What we sought to find out was people's understanding of the issues that I've just discussed with you. So what are their preferences for different kinds of trees? What's their understanding of the costs of trees? Do they understand the different benefits that trees provide? And are they aware of climate change impacts on the city? And are they concerned about the climate change impacts that will affect Launceston in the future? Second, we wanted to raise people's awareness of these issues that I've just discussed in terms of the scale of impact, the time frame for when these extreme heat events are likely to manifest, and the different options that are available for adapting the city to extreme heat. As you can see from this image here of downtown Launceston, this is one of those streets in the city centre where there's large areas of space devoted to on-street parking and to vehicular transport and very little tree canopy cover. So in total, we spoke to 60 participants. For social research, this is fine because we weren't seeking to generate insights that we could average across the entire population. Instead, what we sought to do was to do a deep dive into people's perceptions, values, attitudes, beliefs, and understandings. Present at the numerous workshops we ran were people who came from lower income neighbourhoods, culturally and linguistically diverse residents, older people, environmental groups, the Chamber of Commerce, which played a major role in driving this urban greening strategy, and council staff and policymakers. Missing, however, and I'll return to this point shortly, missing were Aboriginal people, queer people, LGBTQIA plus people, youth and children, people with a disability, neurodiverse people, and homeless people. We tried reaching out to representatives from these different groups through organisations such as the City Mission and the City of Launceston, but unfortunately, we were unable to recruit people from these backgrounds to the workshops, and that should come as no surprise. People from these missing demographics often experience the highest levels of disadvantage. They may be holding down 2 or more jobs. They may have insecure tenure, and attending a workshop on urban greening probably is not high on their list of priorities. You can see from this image here, a house in the northern suburbs of Launceston. It's an older house built in the 1950s with a dark roof that soaks up heat in the summer and very little in the way of tree canopy cover, just some ornamental shrubs planted in the garden. This particular dwelling would be at heightened risk of heat in an extreme heat event. But one of the benefits is this structure here is made out of wood paneling, and the wood is less likely to trap and hold heat overnight for long periods of time. Whereas buildings in Launceston that are made out of bricks, out of masonry, trap heat for much longer. All right, let's look at some of the questions we asked people as we begin to wrap up the seminar today, and I'll open up for some questions of your own that you might want to ask me. First, we asked people about their experiences with trees. We had a warm-up question and we asked people to tell us, did they have a favourite kind of tree, and to describe the characteristics of that tree. We asked them, have they ever planted a tree? What type of tree did they plant and why did they plant it? And then importantly, we asked them, did they think this tree would be appropriate for being planted around their neighbourhood and why? And people gave us all kinds of amazing stories. For example, one participant told us about a tree that was in her yard when she was a little girl. She was a little girl and used to live in Queensland. She moved to Tasmania more recently. And she said a flying fox, a sugar glider, fell out of that tree when she was little. And she nursed this little sugar glider and cared for it, hoping to keep it alive. But unfortunately, it died. And it made a very big impact on her as a child, this poor little animal and the tree that it used to live in. And so she told this story to her children and raised them with environmental values, thinking about the benefits of the tree in the city for wildlife. And now those children are growing up and have children of their own, and her grandchildren have visited that property and gone back and looked at the tree that they've heard stories about. So we can see this kind of attachment to nature, attachment to trees, echoing across generations. So we talked about trees that people like and that they don't like, and we asked them why they don't like some trees in particular. The older participants at the workshops told us that they're quite afraid of some trees because they obstruct the view of the path when they're walking along, or they uplift the pavement and make it difficult for them to walk safely. Many of them have mobility issues, hip issues, they struggle to walk. Some of them told us stories about children in the mall in the middle of Launceston who took nuts and fruit from those trees, and they had fights and they would throw them at each other. Now that's fun if you're a kid, but if you're an older person and you get hit in the face by fruit thrown at high velocity, it's not such a fun experience. So they were quite scared in these areas where they might slip or trip or where young people might be very boisterous and throw fallen fruit or nuts at them. We also asked them about how trees affect them emotionally. So aside from that sad story I told you about the sugar glider dying, people did tell us that trees made them happy. They said how delighted they were to wake up in the morning and hear birdsong. Some people formed very, very strong attachments to trees, but they also told us that those trees would not be appropriate to be planted all across the city because they were too tall. We talked about caring for trees and whether people would be prepared to look after trees themselves if trees were planted in the city in the future. And would they even be prepared to pay for the cost of some of those changes of greening the city? And surprisingly, we were amazed to learn that many people said they would be prepared to pay in some way towards the cost of tree care and tree maintenance. Ultimately, though, they think that local government should be responsible for looking after trees that are planted on public land. And then we finished up by talking about climate change. So the very same images I showed you of the tree canopy mapping and the land surface temperature mapping and the inequality indices we showed to workshop participants. Most participants told us stories about having experienced changes in climate change. One participant told us that the garden hoses and their taps used to freeze in winter, freeze solid. So they couldn't turn the tap on because the water was frozen, the outside taps. And they said that never happens now. The city is much warmer than it used to be in the past. Many had heard about heat waves, but thought that they were something that occurred in other parts of the world, not in Tasmania, and certainly not in Launceston. Having learned about the climate change threats that are facing the city, the overwhelming majority of people we spoke to said that they would be prepared to plant trees now in their neighbourhoods, even if it wouldn't benefit them directly. Older people especially won't be around in the future when these climate change risks manifest more strongly, but they still said that they would be prepared to plant trees. And they came up with a wide variety of trees. Culturally and linguistically diverse communities said, for example, that they would love to have trees planted that were food trees or that connected them more strongly with their cultures. So some of the people at the workshops were from India, and they said, even though they thought it may not be appropriate and they might not grow in Launceston at the moment, planting trees like mango trees would be really important for them and would be really special. So again, we get multiple benefits of trees that might not stand out. Okay, so here's some direct quotes from the workshop participants. One participant, this was a council worker, told us that they had been involved in tree planting on Wellington Street, and they had taken a photograph where all the freshly planted trees had been cut down in the middle of the night. Someone came along with a chainsaw and cut down those trees. So each of those trees, to plant it in a tree cell in the street can cost $8,000 to $14,000 per tree, plus the tree cost itself and its long-term management. And if you multiply that over a kilometre for a city street, you can quickly see how that's a lot of money lost in a single act of vandalism. Another workshop participant said the maintenance has always been a big factor for them. A tree in the ground is lovely, but maintaining it for 20 years, that's when the hard part comes. I don't know if it's the type of tree or just because it's poorly maintained, but it annoys me when you try and walk along a footpath and the tree's too low and you're ducking and you're weaving and your acorns are on the ground and it's causing you a worry and the roots are uplifting the pavement. And then they paused and they said, but you know, I can't think of one tree that I don't like physically or emotionally, which is pretty amazing. So the key workshop findings, just to wrap up, they included overshadowing and loss of access to sunlight. If you plant the wrong trees in Launceston, where it's very cold in winter, houses will become colder. Damage to pavements and infrastructure, as I just mentioned, concerns about safety and security, worries about slip and trip hazards, and worries about the cost of maintaining trees into the future. But many tree benefits were identified, and indeed the tree benefits outweighed the tree costs. These included making the city more beautiful, providing shade in summer, attracting birds and wildlife to the city, improving people's health and well-being, and importantly, creating a sense of belonging in the city. People who lived in Launceston and those neighbourhoods with very low tree canopy cover were very supportive of planting trees as a climate change adaptation response. So the good news from what could be quite a grim story is that the City of Launceston at the beginning of this year took our evidence base and used that to inform their urban greening strategy from 2023 to 2040. And Council has now officially adopted this, and they have begun planting trees already in the ground in those northern suburbs that are most vulnerable to extreme heat events. So it's very heartening to know that the combination of remote sensing data, sophisticated GIS analysis, and social science can produce policy that is adopted and we hope will be effective. We learned some key lessons, and I'm going to wrap up so I allow time for questions. It's really important to recognise the issues and the problems when it comes to responding to climate change. Not everybody has the same capacity or ability to respond, and not everybody is going to recognise climate change risks and threats. It's also really important to ensure that processes are in place to ensure that those people with high needs from diverse backgrounds have an equal ability to be involved. We need to make sure that diverse groups are involved in decision making, so we consider all perspectives. And this includes not just the initial design and planning, but also monitoring, evaluation, and implementation. We need to be transparent about how we make these policies so that people can be confident and trust government. We're seeing the erosion and loss of trust in governments around the world at the moment. And so being open and transparent and presenting information in an easy to understand way is critically important for shaping policy, but also people's confidence in that policy. And then finally, it takes time to listen and learn. So we can't rush these sorts of decisions, and we can't rush this policy as much as we need to. You can see here on the left-hand side is a little flyer that reports our insights that we've learned from this research, and there's a QR code. If you were to scan this QR code, it will take you to our report where we talk about the importance of inclusive urban greening. There's a series of principles for engagement. I'm not going to go through these in great detail because I've already discussed many of them, but they include the importance of recognising opposing viewpoints, the importance of providing translation services for people who do not speak the native language, ensuring that people with disabilities can participate in these kinds of exercises, and ensuring that venues and formats for the research are respectful of differences. And if necessary, even remunerating people, paying them to attend these workshops because they otherwise may be unable to because of some of the barriers that I mentioned earlier. So the next steps, as Pooja hinted at, will include potentially a summer workshop that we're looking at running on the next stage in our research, which is deploying temperature sensors in the built environment to measure some of these changes in heat over time, to engage in citizen science, to bring people with us on this journey, and then to build strong collaborations with you, wherever you might be around the world, so that collectively we can start to take on addressing some of these tasks. So thank you, and I'd like to open up to questions.
Thank you so much, Jason, for highlighting and emphasizing how much inclusivity is important for research perspective. Having done research in this area and coming from a developing nation, I know that most and majority of the research that has been done is from the developed nations, and they are not really inclusive. So thank you so much for emphasizing on this and shedding light on how important it is to have an inclusive greening plan. We have few questions. So I'll start with the first question is like, how do tree species and canopy area influence heat effects? And how can rooftop gardens mitigate this effect on a flat concrete roof?
Excellent question. So different species of tree will have different canopy cover. trees that are more columnar in form, such as cypress trees, those long, thin, stick-like looking trees, might be aesthetically attractive, but they will have very little impact on urban temperatures in terms of shading the built environment. Trees with broad canopies, so if you think of trees like the most common tree we see in cities around the world, the London plane tree, very broad canopy, a deciduous tree that loses its leaves in winter. Underneath that tree, temperatures can be up to 20 degrees Celsius cooler on the road surface or the built environment surface under the tree. The ambient temperature, the air temperature, will be in the vicinity of 8 degrees cooler. And trees cool in two ways. I've mentioned that one mechanism, shading, but trees also evapotranspire. They release water into the atmosphere as they breathe out during the day as a product of photosynthesis and respiration at nighttime. And that increased humidity actually lowers the temperature. There is a problem though. The inverse occurs where you have a densely planted canopy across a city. At nighttime, that canopy will mean air circulation is lower. The sky view factor is much lower. You can't see the sky under the tree canopy cover. And that means that thermal radiation can't escape as easily. So the trees act like an insulating blanket that can warm the built environment by somewhere between 0.5 degree and 1 degree Celsius. So hopefully I've answered that question.
Yeah. The second question is, was ground data on the land surface temperature collected? If not, I thought it would be beneficial to conduct a citizen participatory experiment, as it would both raise awareness of the dangers of heat waves and allow us to collect data to support remote sensing data.
That's an excellent question. I love that question. And Pooja's smiling because that is indeed the next step that we're going to be taking. We have a grant from the Commonwealth Government in Australia, the federal government, to do multi-year research across 3 cities in Australia, Hobart, Brisbane and Sydney, running a thermal gradient from cool temperate in the south to warm, humid, hot subtropical in the north, and running from coast to 60 kilometres inland along a transect. And we'll be putting HOBO MX2302 sensors, which collect information on relative humidity and temperature. We'll be deploying those sensors at 1 kilometre intervals in the built environment. We'll also be deploying Kestrel drop tag, the D2 drop tag temperature sensors and relative humidity sensors under a tree canopy immediately surrounding those HOBO sensors, so we can compare the difference between tree canopy cover and no tree canopy cover in different urban morphologies across the built environment of these 3 cities. So that's our next research, and Pooja will be joining me as a postdoctoral researcher doing that research. So we're very excited about that. It's the first time that this kind of research has been done. And ultimately, we would like to go back to Launceston and replicate that work in Launceston so we can compare the remote sensing with the in situ temperature sensing and monitoring.
Yes, it's really exciting. And if I may chime in into that, this is the sensor that we are going to use, if you can see. And along with that, we are also working on protocol that will help us replicate this kind of study in all the parts of the world. So irrespective of wherever we are staying, with the limited resources, we'll be able to conduct a similar kind of study. And I saw
And you can
Jason
see,
got some more toys.
yeah, you can see we have a radiation shield that sits on top of the probe to ensure that we're controlling for direct sunlight on that sensor, so it's not exposed to direct sunlight. So we're trying to think this through carefully. I think as a social scientist, I keep impressing Pooja because I'm learning more and more about this every day. Thank you for that great question.
Thank you. Heading on to the next question, to what extent does the color of a roof affect the land surface temperature?
It's a great question, and this is all to do with albedo. So roofs that are more reflective, that have higher albedos, will reflect the incoming thermal radiation off the roof and away from the structure back into the atmosphere. So if, for example, you have a city that has predominantly light grey or white coloured roofs, the built environment will be substantially cooler than a city that has dark grey or black roofs. We're seeing a trend in Australia for what's called the Scandi trend, where people think that dark coloured roofs are more aesthetically pleasing, architecturally stylish. And so there are entire suburbs like Western Sydney now that have dark coloured roofs, even though Western Sydney is experiencing temperatures in the vicinity of 50 degrees Celsius in the summer. It's important to note also that just a little higher than 50 degrees Celsius is the limit at which people can live without any kind of cooling in the built environment. Human tissue begins to dissolve at those temperatures, and you die pretty quickly from exposure to heat at those temperatures. So one intervention we could do, remembering that it takes 30 years to grow an urban forest and achieve the tree canopy cover we need. One intervention we could do is to paint road surfaces lighter to reflect the heat, to paint footpaths lighter, and to modify those roofs to make them more reflective. All of this costs money, considerably more than if we plant trees. And so another suggestion that people have had is that we make, and one of the people in the other question asked this question, if we put green roofs, if we grow vegetation on top of the roof, could that lower temperature, or green walls? The answer is yes, but not all roofs in the city can bear the weight of the soil that's required, and then the plants on top for having a green roof. And remember, the soil has to hold water as well, which means the roof is even heavier still. So maybe it's a hybrid intervention for those roofs that can't support that weight, where you put a pergola or a trellis and you grow vines across the top of that structure to try and cool the roof. So grapevines, for example, which would lose their leaves in winter and still give you access to sunshine. They've tried this in Darwin in the north of Australia, putting shade structures into the heart of the city and growing vines up those shade structures. And the vines, unfortunately, could not live in those high temperatures in the urban core. And so that didn't work. In other parts of the world, though, like Chicago, the city hall has successfully been covered in a green roof using prairie plants endemic to the area. And that has substantially reduced the temperature, the thermal load in that building, has improved people's health and well-being because they can access these beautiful green spaces, has brought biodiversity back into the city, but that solution won't be available for every building in the city, unfortunately. There's another question I can see here in the chat, Pooja, about a strategy in Europe that's unfolding called depaving. There are cities in Europe at the moment that are tearing up concrete, removing that paving and converting it to green space in an effort to cool the city, but also, as I mentioned before, to reduce flooding, the kind of flooding we've seen in Spain recently. And part of the strategy that Launceston could adopt is depaving the city to take some of those road surfaces and convert them to green space cover. But we're fighting people's attitudes and their values. A lot of people like to drive their cars. They want to park right in the middle of the city outside a shop or an apartment building. And therefore, they get really angry if you take away their parking and replace it with a tree or with a grassy area. We also have to take into account that if we're just putting small grasses and shrubs into the built environment, that cooling will be less than if we had tree canopy cover. So research that was done in Sydney in Australia has shown that we could expect in the vicinity of 0.5 degree to at maximum 4 degrees Celsius reduction in temperatures, surface temperatures from grasses and shrubs. as opposed to the 8 to 12 degrees that come from irrigated grasses, blue areas of water like lakes and ponds, and dense tree canopy. So the combination of the vegetation and the blue infrastructure matters as well.
Thank you so much, Jason. We have one more question. How green area and thermal inequality is addressed in the new urban greening strategies 2023 to 2040?
So the great news from the City of Launceston strategy is because we co-designed this policy with the policymakers, we ran the workshops with them to bring them on board and to have them comfortable with the research that we were going to do first to understand the science behind the methods we were using. They came on a journey with us, and we pointed out to them that many parts of the city, and they already knew this, had high levels of socioeconomic disadvantage. So when we presented the findings of our research to them, they were only too happy to include that in the urban greening strategy. So on the slide that I showed before, and I might just toggle back to this slide for you so you can see the urban greening strategy. This slide here, you can see, comes directly from the City of Launceston's urban greening strategy. On the left at the top here is this tree canopy cover. Then we have land surface temperature in the middle, and then on the right, the priority based on the socioeconomic characteristics of neighbourhoods. And so the city has included statements around thermal inequity in its urban greening strategy, has directly addressed that, and has targeted their early tree planting in these northern suburbs neighbourhoods, which is a very heartening outcome, and we're really excited about achieving that result.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's really exciting to see your research turn to reality, which is like the best part of putting all the hard work in.
It's very
There's
heartening.
there's one more question in the chat. Do you know any city with white roof?
Yeah, there are different cities around the world that are experimenting with light colored roofs at the moment. Los Angeles in California is experimenting both with painting streets white and converting roofs to light colored roofs. Baltimore in Maryland in the United States is investigating a paint that can be rolled onto the top of their roofs. Most of their roofs on the row houses in Baltimore are made out of tar, out of asphalt. And so they absorb a lot of summer heat. And the buildings themselves are masonry, so they're exploring light colored roofs. But in terms of a city-wide strategy where a city has adopted a requirement that all roofs be light coloured, it's highly political. In Sydney, the planning minister tried to bring in legislation that would require that all new roofs were light. He wanted to ban dark coloured roofs. And the development industry pushed back and lobbied so hard that the minister backed down and they did not progress that legislation. So you definitely need to bring residents on the journey with you to build that support for legislative change.
Yeah, I agree that political influence can sometimes affect what kind of outcome we want, but then citizens have the most power to choose their politicians wisely as well. So,
They do indeed, as we're about to see soon in the United States.
yeah, that's true. I think we have addressed all the questions. Do we have any more questions from the audience? If not, and if you're interested to know more about the upcoming webinars, you can sign into our mailing group. So you'll find more information over here in the chat. And I would like to give a big thank to Jason for spending this time rescheduling the webinar and bringing to us such an amazing content from your research. Really grateful. Thank you so much, audience, for joining in on different time zones. And
And I'd like
Over
to
to you.
thank the IEEE for this opportunity as well, Pooja. I'm very grateful that I could share this research with everybody in the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
I like also to thank you very much, Jason and Pooja, for doing this webinar today. So both you have done a really fantastic job. Thanks a lot. And I like also to thank the audience and say with this goodbye. And we are closing now the session.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a
Bye,
great
everybody.
day. Bye-bye.